Here in the Center for Imaging Science, and today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Jacobs. So those of you who are interested in artificial intelligence or human vision, I think will really enjoy today's talk. Dr. Jacobs obtained his PhD in computer science from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and after that he did two postdocs, one at Harvard and one at MIT. And before becoming a professor of brain and cognitive sciences just down the river at the University of Rochester. His research program uses computational modeling and human experimentation to study human perception, cognition, including recognition, categorization, learning, and other facets. So I think you're under our treat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs.
Okay, thanks, Chris, a lot for inviting me here. Can people hear me in the back? Yeah, that's okay. If you can't speak up, then I'll try and speak louder. So that works. My research program studies human perceptual and cognitive processing, things like recognition, categorization, learning, memory, reasoning, decision-making. And we study these in the domains of both visual and multisensory perception. Methodologically, our work uses both behavioral experimentation and theory development through computational modeling. We've mostly focused on three related domains: visual working memory, sensory cue integration, and abstract mental representations of objects and events. In all of these areas, we very much place an emphasis on working at the interface between perception and cognition, and emphasis on the importance of inference and abstraction, and you'll see that in today's talk. Within the domain of visual working memory, we've claimed that visual working memory provides a task-dependent summary. It has to be a summary because visual working memory is limited capacity of the visual environment. We also claim that visual working memory optimality depends on understanding both the statistical properties of the visual environment and the task constraints. And we think that our perspective explains biases and other inaccuracies in people's visual working memories. Within the domain of sensory cue integration, we claim that in many cases, people combine information from multiple cues or sensory modalities in a statistically optimal manner. And we claim that people's sensory integration rules are adaptable based on the statistical properties of the perceptual environment. We also work in the domain of abstract mental representations of objects and events, and that's going to be the focus of today's talk. So this slide, in some sense, is really an outline of the talk. We claim that people acquire and use abstract. When I say abstract, I'm going to mean modality independent. That'll be clearer. Abstract representations of objects shared by vision and haptics. Haptics is active vision when you grasp an object and you learn about, let's say, that object's shape. And I'll be telling you about two projects from the lab on that topic. We claim that object shape representations inferred from visual signals are 3D and object-centered, so Project 3 will touch on that topic. And we claim that people acquire and use abstract representations of time that are shared by both perception and motor action. So Project 4 will touch on that topic. Why am I focusing on abstraction? I think that the reason is nicely illustrated by a quote from a short story by Jorge Luis Borges. In his short story, he writes the following about the main character of the short story. It was not only difficult for him to understand that the generic term dog embraced so many unlike specimens of different sizes and different forms. He was disturbed by the fact that a dog at 314, let's say seen in profile, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front. With no effort, he had learned English, French, Portuguese, and Latin. I suspect, however, that he was not very capable of thought. To think is to forget differences, generalize, make abstractions. So this quote really highlights that making abstractions is really key to thought and cognition. In projects 1 and 2, we address the question, are there abstract, again, by abstract I mean modality independent, mental representations of objects shared by vision and haptics? Keep in mind that we live in a multi-sensory world. For example, while eating breakfast, you see your coffee cup, you grasp your coffee cup, or both. That raises the following question. Are the shape representations acquired when seeing your cup distinct from the representations acquired when grasping your cup? If so, these would be modality-specific representations. Or does there exist a level at which the shape representation of your cup is the same regardless of the sensory modality through which the cup is perceived? If so, these would be modality independent, or what I'm often going to call multisensory representations. Within this study of multisensory perception, my lab has really focused on cross-modal transfer of knowledge. So this occurs when you learn to perform a task when stimuli are defined in one sensory modality. However, you apply the acquired knowledge when stimuli are defined in a novel sensory modality. So this illustrates what I would call modality invariance, an important type of perceptual constancy. I just want to illustrate this very quickly. This is an experiment done by Ilker Yildirim and I. Ilker was a graduate student in the lab. He's currently a postdoc at MIT. And in this experiment, we use objects that are known in the literature as fribbles. Fribbles were designed by Mike Tarr, a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and his colleagues to study visual object recognition. In our experiment, we used 4 categories of fribbles with 10 exemplars per category. So in the top row here, these 2 belong to category 1, these 2 belong to category 2, these 2 category 3, and these 2 category 4. Something unusual that my lab has done is that we've taken these objects, these are those images, they were designed on a computer, they're being visually rendered in the top row. But we've taken these objects and we've actually fabricated them using 3D printing. So in our experiments, these are real physical objects. And that's what's being shown in the bottom row here. So we took photos of the fabricated objects. So you can see they should look exactly like the computer renderings because they're generated from the exact same shape files. We had 2 groups of subjects. One group of subjects was trained to haptically categorize these objects during training. Following training, we gave them visual test trials. For the other group of subjects, they were visually trained to categorize the objects. Following visual training, they were given haptic test trials. So this graph here shows subjects' performances at the end of training. And this graph shows their performances at the start of the test trials. And what this shows is that subjects, at least in this particular case, had pretty much perfect cross-modal transfer from the training sensory modality to the novel sensory modality.
So in the haptic training and testing, are they blindfolded?
They're blindfolded and then the object is placed in their hand. They have 8 seconds. They can use 2 hands. They have 8 seconds to grasp the object. Okay, in project 1, my collaborators were Gökçe Erdogan and Ilker Yildirim. Gökçe and Ilker were graduate students in my lab. Gökçe graduated just a couple of months ago. He's joined a machine learning company called Cogitai. Ilker, you've seen, he was a graduate student in the lab. He's currently a postdoc at MIT. In project 1, our question was, do multisensory representations underlie people's object similarity judgments in visual, haptic, and visual haptic environments? And if so, are these representations part-based? So previous research has suggested that people's visual object representations are often part-based. For this experiment, we designed novel visual haptic stimuli. So these are shown here. Each of these objects has 5 parts. So there's one part, kind of this main body right there, that's common to all of the objects. On each object, there are 4 locations at which one of 2 parts might exist at that location. So at this location here, you either get that part or you get that part. This location over here, you either get this part or you get this part. For this location over here, you either get this part or you get that part. And it's hard to see, but for this location over here, you either get that part or that part. They are different, but it's hard to see here. With 4 locations and 2 parts per location, there's 16 possible objects. So there they are. And again, we designed these objects on the computer, but then we fabricated them using 3D printing. In our experiment, we asked subjects to give us pairwise object similarity ratings. So in each trial, a subject observed 2 objects and rated their similarity on a scale of 1 to 7. There were 4 sensory conditions. I should say this is 4 separate groups of subjects. In the visual condition, the subjects saw the 2 objects. In the haptic condition, subjects grasped the 2 objects. In the cross-modal condition, subjects saw one of the objects but grasped the other objects. And in the multisensory condition, subjects saw and grasped both objects. Here I'm showing you the average correlations in,
Were these at the same time? Did they hold them both at the same time, see them both at the same time, or serially?
Serially. Okay. This graph shows you the average correlations in subject similarity ratings. So let's say for the visual cell, that's the average correlation when the 2 subjects were both in the visual condition. The visual haptic cell, this is the average correlations when one of the subjects was in the visual condition, the other subject was in the haptic condition. As you can see, these correlations, they're fairly large. Within condition and across condition correlations are equally large, suggesting that subjects gave similar similarity ratings in all sensory conditions. We further analyzed subject similarity ratings using what's known as a Bayesian non-parametric additive clustering technique due to Navarro and Griffiths. This is based on something out of the machine learning literature known as an Indian buffet process. If you don't know what that is, it's okay. The input to this technique is a set of average correlations for one of the sensory conditions. The output is a posterior probability distribution over object representations. So this technique is looking for object representations that would be most likely to give rise to the given similarity ratings. The technique assumes that object representations are represented by binary features. However, the dimensionality of the object representations, that is, the number of binary features, is not fixed. That's what makes this a non-parametric technique. We applied this technique to the average correlations in each of the 4 sensory conditions. And it turned out in every case we got exactly the same result, which I'm going to call a list of parts representation. So it had a dimensionality of 4. There's 4 binary features, which indicated which of 2 interchangeable parts was present at each object location. So note what this technique did. Given a set of similarity ratings, the technique actually recovered how we generated our objects. Remember, the objects had 4 locations in which one of 2 parts was at each location. And this learns a binary feature for each of those. Moreover, it did this in every one of the 4 sensory conditions, suggesting that subjects' similarity ratings were sensory invariant modality invariant. So all of this suggests that part-based object representations underlie subject similarity judgments in all sensory conditions. To account for this behavioral data, we developed a theoretical framework. This framework asks, how do people abstract over sensory signals in order to acquire modality-independent conceptual representations. And our theoretical framework says there's 3 required components. The first component is you need a representational language for characterizing these modality-independent multisensory representations. So you need this language for building modality-independent object shape representations. The second component is you need sensory-specific representations sensory-specific forward models that map multisensory representations to sensory features. So we often think of this as kind of implementing forms of sensory imagery. If you map an object shape to a visual image of that object, well, that's kind of like visual imagery. The third component is you need to learn multisensory representations from sensory signals by inverting the forward models. Remember, the forward models map from these modality-independent multisensory representations to sensory signals. But perception goes the opposite direction. Perception goes from sensory signals to these modality-independent representations. So we have to invert the forward models. And the way we do that is through Bayesian inference. Okay, this slide gives an overview of our model. I'm just going to mention the components of the model on this slide, but then I'm going to give you more details on subsequent slides. So the model includes multisensory representations of object shape. Those representations are characterized using something called the shape grammar. The model has sensory-specific forward models. There's both a vision-specific and a haptic-specific forward model. The model uses Bayesian inference in order to infer multisensory object representations from visual and/or haptic signals. And once the model has shape representations for 2 objects, it has a similarity metric to say how similar those 2 shapes are. Okay, so that first piece was multisensory representations of object shape, which are characterized using a shape grammar. I should say shape grammars are fairly commonplace in both the computer vision and computer graphics communities. We've used a grammar which is a probabilistic context-free grammar. The terminals of the grammar are the possible parts of these objects. So that's what's shown here. The production rules of the grammar say how parts can be combined in order to form objects. There's another piece to this grammar which actually gives the spatial relations among different parts. But for brevity, I'm not showing you that on this slide.
This looks a lot like recognition by components.
I'm getting there. It could be, yes, absolutely. Yes. Recognition by components, I'll get to that. It doesn't literally have a shape grammar, but that's a little bit of a technical point. So what is an object in this framework? An object is a production or a derivation from the grammar. The model also has these sensory-specific forward models. So we have a vision-specific forward model, which maps an estimate of a multisensory object representation to a set of visual features. You can implement this using any computer graphics library. So that's what computer graphics does. You give it a 3D shape representation, and computer graphics will visually render that visual shape from some viewpoint. In our work, we typically just use OpenGL as a well-known graphics library. We also have a haptic-specific forward model, which maps an estimate of a multisensory object representation to a set of haptic features. And for that, we're using the GraspIt hand simulator. GraspIt comes out of the robotics community. So it's illustrated over here. It's a simulator of a human hand. And what we can do is we can take our objects and we can place them in the hand and then close the fingers of the hand around our objects. And while the hand is grasping one of our objects, what we do is we read off the joint angles of the hand. The hand has 16 joint angles. And we use those joint angles as our haptic features. So these joint angles characterize the shape of the hand as the hand is grasping the object. We don't just do this once, but we do it 24 times. Each time there's a different orientation between an object and the hand. So in this figure here, it's the same object in the 3 panels, but the object is at a different orientation in the hand. And we think of this use of multiple grasp as a way of approximating active haptic exploration. The next component is Bayesian inference. We need to infer multisensory object representations from visual or haptic signals. And what we do is we use our shape grammar in order to infer a parse tree characterizing an object's parts and the spatial relations among these parts. The Bayesian inference algorithm is implemented as an MCMC, or Metropolis Hastings sampler. It includes a prior distribution, giving a bias toward simpler parse trees, and a likelihood function which asks, how well do the visual or haptic features of a proposed object representation match the visual or haptic features of an observed object? And this requires the use of these sensory-specific forward models. So I know not everybody is a Bayesian aficionado. Just intuitively, here's what I just said. The model is doing a search in shape space, so the space of all possible shapes. That space is defined by the shape grammar. This is an infinite space because the shape can generate an infinite number of objects. You can search this space using sampling-based techniques. And what's being done here is we're searching this shape space in order to find a shape which, let's say, when visually rendered, gives rise to something similar to the observed visual features, or when haptically rendered, gives rise to something similar to the observed haptic features. And if you can get a shape which gives rise to the observed visual features of the observed haptic features, well, that's a good candidate. Maybe with high probability, you'll say, oh, that seems like a good candidate shape. So how well does this work? I'm showing you a representative simulation. The input to the model are these 3 images. I should say they're images, it's the same object. It's just that the images are taken from orthogonal viewpoints. The output of the model is a posterior distribution over these object shape representations. So I'm just showing you the shape representation with the highest posterior probability. There's 3 things you should note about this representation. One is it takes the form of a parse tree. Well, why is that? It's because the model knows the shape grammar. Everything, shapes are being characterized in terms of the shape grammar, so it has a parse tree form. The second thing to note is that it's inferred the correct parse tree. That is to say, it's identified a set of parts and a set of spatial relations among the parts that are correct for this object. So that's good. The third piece, and this is kind of the key piece, is that this shape representation is modality invariant. So I've shown you a simulation in which the input to the model was a visual input. What if we don't give it a visual input? Instead, what if we were to take this object and we put it and grasp it, and we read off the joint angles and we give the model the joint angles? Under that condition, what shape representation does the model infer? It's the same representation. So that's the win of this system. It infers these object shape representations which are modality independent. Okay, once we've got shape representations for 2 objects, we need a similarity metric which tells us how similar are the 2 shapes. And for that, we've been using tree edit distance. So we count the number of insertion, deletion, and relabel operations required to convert parse tree 1 to parse tree 2. So just to be clear on that, imagine that the model is given a visual input for object 1. Based on that, it infers some object shape representation. For object 2, it's given a haptic input, and based on that, it infers an object shape representation for object 2. Now we want to say, well, how similar are these two objects in shape? So we need to compare these two shape representations, and we're going to do that using this tree edit distance similarity metric. Okay, so here I'm comparing the model's predictions and our subject's data. That is, we're correlating the models and subject similarity ratings. I'm almost embarrassed to put this graph up. These correlations, they're near 1. The models worked very well. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe too well. In some ways, it shouldn't be too surprising. Keep in mind a few things. This is a small domain. There are these 16 objects. There's not very many. Keep in mind, I showed you behavioral data. When we analyzed that data, it seemed like people were making their similarity judgments based on 3D parts, 3D representations that are part-based, and the representations of modality and variant. And then I showed you a theoretical model where for the model, it's using 3D part-based modality and variant representations. And so the model ends up looking like people. So that's the result. Just to summarize project 1, we've been asking, are there abstract representations of objects shared by vision and haptics? I told you about some behavioral data suggesting that the answer is yes. And then I told you about a theoretical model of how these multisensory modality-independent object representations can be acquired from sensory signals. So, oh, good. Yep.
So when you had the people in the lab, did you do any sort of think aloud protocol or something to get from some of the users, like what did they think they're thinking?
Mostly no, not formally, informally, but mostly no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so you had a perfect correlation with the similarity metrics.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you had an opportunity to get a confusion matrix and whether your model made the same mistakes. I'm not sure if there was an opportunity to get that.
Yeah. We did look at that. They kind of look similar, and I guess I could have given a correlation to say how similar, but I don't have that, and I probably should. Good.
I'm just trying to understand, so in terms of how these objects are represented, when you built the objects, you made sure that the grammar defined the complexity of the task, really. And I wonder how that compares to the complexity of a task like this in other domains, right? I mean, you see, it is somewhat, yeah, it should be good at this task because there are only like so many little component shapes. But when I'm really haptically exploring something that's a little more, that isn't a part of your object library, what's the information? It's not that, not everything has those weird knobby things there.
Okay.
So I guess, so I'm sorry, this is a really poorly phrased question. Tough stuff, but what is the information if we're not constrained by your task?
Yeah.
I guess there's some aspect here that's lost. What is the information in?
Oh, haptic perception is considerably richer than what we've done here.
Right.
We've been using joint angles from GraphSpit, but there's all sorts of skin deformations and so on within haptic perception. And so we're just only very partially modeling haptic perception. Does that get it?
It kind of does. I guess the way I think about it is at the first stage of the active perception, there are that input is way more complex than is there a knobby thing or not on each of this clearly defined object space. They all have the cylinder. And so I wonder to what's the issue? I don't know if there's an issue here. with the fact that you're bottlenecking the information source. It can be reduced to this very clean grammar.
Yeah, sure. You're right. I mean, we've simplified things. We built these objects that are very part-based, and why is that? Because we built them using the shape grammar. Shape grammars are very good for building part-based objects. For other objects which are fuzzy or which are not so clearly part-based, shape grammars might be not the right tool. We mostly use shape grammars. I don't know, our colleagues in computer vision and computer graphics have developed them, and
Yeah.
we could sort of take them off the shelf. So,
Okay, yeah, working.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
yeah.
Have you tried to look outside the lab for similar things, similar happening of people using vision or using haptic modes to see if it matched what you did in the lab?
No, but at least intuitively, you'll have to tell me. I think we see and grasp objects all the time. I see something, I grasp it. I see my coffee cup, I grasp my coffee cup. Just intuitively, I think I'm getting at the same shape. If they were very different shapes, that would be rather startling.
I'm going to give you a real-life example. Years ago in Building 126, they had an inspector looking at M126 cartridge film,
Uh-huh.
see if they were well made or not. They had, obviously, people who could see, and had one blind inspector. And the blind inspector was as good, if not better, than the people who could see.
Oh,
And a
okay.
real,
Yeah.
true-life application.
Yeah.
Which,
No.
of course, no longer exists.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that might be the exception to the rule, but yes. I kind of, often I think of this as, and this happens to me too many times, I go to the airport and I get pulled down a line by TSA and they're going to search my bags and they look inside and they reach all over and I assume there's some tight correspondence between what they see and what they are grasping in my bags. So, yeah.
So, I'm curious, so if I understand correctly, the RASPIT coding, right, is essentially like a static snapshot. You
Yep.
have 20 joint angles or something, right?
Yep.
And then you change that to another orientation, right?
Yep.
And that seems very different than active touch, right, where there's you're running your finger over the edge of something.
Yep,
and so
absolutely.
What does it mean that your model is working so well with just this very limited amount of information? And how does
Yeah.
it generalize to?
Right. It's not so limited. We did 24 grasps. That's a fairly big number, although this would work with fewer. Remember, we just kind of need to, there's only 16 objects. We need to distinguish these objects from these objects. In a richer world with many more objects where they're closer in shape, that might be a more difficult issue. But in this domain, that seems to be more than adequate. So, yeah. But with 24 grasps, you're getting a lot.
So then why don't you just do that? Why don't we do this in the world? Why don't we just,
Oh, yeah. I think because there is information in a much more dynamic, active haptic exploration, but it wasn't required in this domain.
So, I thought it was interesting, unlike Gabe, I'm having trouble formulating the question. The first being, it looked like you were using non-accidental viewpoints to build your visual model. And you're also, so the picture you showed of the object, you were viewing end-on from, and I'm thinking about the literature on human object recognition, like canonical views, Palmer,
Yeah.
and so this doesn't look a lot to me like human object recognition.
Oh,
And it doesn't look like haptic
Right.
recognition.
In the behavioral experiment, we gave them a very canonical three-quarter view. It was very easy to see the 3D structure. For the model, we gave it these 3 views from orthogonal viewpoints. So because of those 3 views from orthogonal viewpoints, you get a lot of the 3D structure.
So, but I guess then are you trying to understand humans or understand how a possible means of object recognition would work? And it's kind of tied to Jim's question,
yeah.
that some of the ways of holding the object you showed, I realize it was just those 3 views, is I can't imagine anyone ever holding an object that way. Like
In
the-
these 24 different views?
Yeah, but the grasping, when people grasp and the way they scale their grasp,
Uh-huh.
it doesn't look like how a person would choose to hold an object.
Oh, I'm not sure. I have an object, I have two hands, I'm gonna grasp it multiple times from different orientations. We use 24 orientations. I don't know, is 24 the right number or not? I'm not so sure that's,
But I guess part of my question would be are your correlations very high because you're choosing 24 orientations for the object where sometimes a person wouldn't, well, what happens if you only use a subset of those?
oh, yeah. No, if I only used, not 24, but I used 2 or 3, performance would absolutely degrade. I would not get very good 3D reconstructions in that case.
But would the person be able to do the similar? So you're doing
Yeah,
a
I don't know. You know, we give them 8 seconds. They're sort of reaching a little bit under a table. They have the object. They get to use 2 hands. And we told them, look, you know, you're supposed to figure out the shape within those 8 seconds. And I think they're doing a fair number of grasps, but we haven't measured that. I better move on. I'm a little bit of, okay, yeah. So
About 20 minutes left.
20 minutes left. We really need to move on. Here we go. Project 2. So in Project 1, we obtained behavioral data from modality-independent object shape representations. What about neural data? So the question here is, what is the format of object shape representations in human temporal occipital cortex? Particularly, does lateral occipital cortex, an area called LOC, encode object shape in a multi-sensory modality-independent format? And does LOC encode object shape in a part-based format? So here are my collaborators. I should say this is a brain imaging study, fMRI study. I am not an expert in fMRI, but one of my colleagues, Brad Mayen, was a faculty colleague in my department. He's the expert in fMRI. And actually, Quan Jing and Frank, they're graduate students in Brad's lab. Okay. LOC has been studied a lot in the literature. It seems to represent visual information about object shape and tends to respond to haptic exploration of objects. And these are some of the well-known papers in the literature. There's many more. An open question is, are LOC responses based on visual presentation of an object and based on haptic presentation of the same object similar to each other? And do LOC responses carry information about the identities of the constituent parts of an object? So I've used the same objects that you've already seen. This experiment had 4 sessions. In session 1, we did retinotopic mapping and somatosensory and motor cortex mapping. Session 2, we used an object-responsive cortex localizer. Session 3 and 4, we did the actual experiment. So we had 2 runs dedicated to visual exploration of objects and another 2 runs dedicated to haptic exploration of objects, where the order of the visual and haptic presentations was counterbalanced across subjects and sessions. Our first question is, are LOC responses based on visual presentation of an object and based on haptic presentation of the same object similar to each other? And to address that question, we use what I'll call cross-modal representational similarity analysis. So we formed a cross-modal correlation matrix. This is a matrix that's going to be 16 by 16. Remember, there's 16 objects. Where in each cell, we correlate the LOC voxel patterns elicited when the subject viewed objects with the patterns elicited when the same subject haptically explored the objects. So for the diagonal entries of this matrix, a subject is seeing an object and grasping the same object. And for the off-diagonal entries, the subject is seeing an object but grasping a different object. And our first question was, are the diagonal entries larger than the average of the off-diagonal entries? And the answer to that was a clear yes. So we didn't even need to do much statistics there. We can ask a more refined question. can we decode object identity using the cross-modal correlation matrix? By testing whether each object is more correlated with itself, again, this is across modalities, than it is with each of the other objects in the set, also across modalities. So here we're asking, is the diagonal entry larger than not the average of the off-diagonal entries, but larger than all of the off-diagonal entries? And the answer to that is yes, but I should say it's only yes at an above chance level. So the decoding accuracy to a machine learning person was not great, but it's above chance. So that suggests that the data is consistent with modality-independent neural representations in LOC. The next question was, can we decode the parts that make up an object from LOC activations? So remember, we've got these objects where there's 4 locations and one of 2 parts appears at that location. We want to see if from LOC activations we can classify what part was at each of these 4 locations. To do that, we trained 4 linear SVM support vector machines. These are classifiers from the machine learning literature. So there's one SVM for each of these part locations. And we did the training using 16-fold leave one out cross correlation. So, so that means we trained the classifiers on 15 objects and we tested on the 16th object. And we did this 16 times, where each time a different object served as the test. And a test object was identified correctly only if all 4 parts are identified correctly. So can you do this? Again, here the answer is yes, but the decoding accuracy, it's not great, but it is significant at above chance levels. So just to summarize, we asked, are there abstract representations of objects shared by vision and haptics? We found that LOC encodes object shape in a multi-sensory modality-independent manner. That is, you can decode object identity using the cross-modal correlation matrix, at least at an above chance level. Similarly, LOC encodes the constituent parts of an object. That is, we can decode object parts from LOC responses, both visually and haptically, again, at above chance levels.
I know you're going quickly, but it's a quick question.
Yeah.
So visual is easy. They're looking at this and they're in the scanner. Haptically, they're holding it for 8 seconds and then you start the scan, or they scan while you're. What do you assume the internal representation is during the scan for haptic?
They're grasping it and we're scanning away.
Is there 8 seconds goes on? Are we watching as the representation is being built, or do we think they have the representation during the scan?
Both, because we're averaging, right? fMRI is slow temporal dynamics, so we're doing quite a bit of averaging, so I don't think we can distinguish those 2. Project 3, this was done with Goker. You've seen his name already. This is a project, good, I should have said. Our question here is, what are the properties of object shape representations inferred from visual signals? This project has a slightly different flavor than projects 1 and 2. We want to use our theoretical framework, which I told you about in project 1, to address key issues in visual object recognition. In particular, we want to look at the claim that viewpoint-dependent visual recognition helps distinguish different types of theories. So in the literature, there are people who have claimed that empirically it's been found that people show very viewpoint-dependent visual object recognition. You can recognize an object from one viewpoint, but you might not recognize it from a different viewpoint. And people have argued that that's very diagnostic as to what theories are correct or not, and I'm going to argue against that. We also want to address the issue, I don't know, I called it hype, regarding recent successes of deep convolutional neural networks. So this is work done by collaboration with Goker. Within the literature, there are many theories of visual object recognition. So there are feature-based theories which argue that object shape is represented by a list of feature values extracted from 2D images. Nowadays, these get implemented using deep convolutional neural networks, things like AlexNet or GoogleNet. A shortcoming of these networks is that they tend to be uninterpretable. Keep in mind, AlexNet, which might be considered small nowadays, has 60 million parameters. We'd like to know if the features it requires are 2D, 3D, something else, viewer-centered, object-centered, or something else. View-based theories argue that the shape representation consists of a collection of memorized views of an object from multiple viewpoints. The primary motivation is that visual recognition is often viewpoint dependent. A standard assumption is that the memorized views are 2D, kind of like images. Shortcomings of this approach is that they require multiple views. You get poor performance from a single view. They assume the same set of features are extracted from all views and assume that there are correct correspondences between features across views. Very problematic assumptions. A third class are structural description theories. They argue that representation of object shape consists of simple shape primitives representing parts and the spatial relations among these primitives. They typically use 3D object-centered representations. I just want to be sure everyone knows what an object-centered representation is. So here's an object. It's a suitcase. There's a coordinate system attached to the object. So according to this coordinate system, here's the top, and here's the back, and here's the side. If we were to rotate the object, we also rotate the coordinate system. So now, based on this rotated coordinate system, we get the same top, we get the same back, we get the same side. And because of this representation, this will give rise to viewpoint independence. Okay, recognition by components, somebody mentioned, is probably the most famous implementation of these theories. Shortcomings is they do not address inference. How can one extract 3D shape primitives and their spatial relations from 2D images? And these theories do not explain viewpoint dependency. So viewpoint dependency seems to favor view-based theories and not favor structural description theories, but I'm going to get back to that. Our approach is very similar to a structural description theory. However, we really emphasize that shape perception requires statistical inference. You need to infer these 3D object-centered representations from 2D images. So to implement our theory, it's the implementation I've already told you. You need 3 components. The first component is a language for representing object shape. You can use a shape grammar. You need these forward predictive models that map from 3D representations to 2D images. And you need to do inference, so you need to invert the forward models. So you can do that Bayesian inference, straight out of Project 1. And here's the kind of objects we use. So columns 1 and 4 show 2D images. The other columns, they're slightly darker, 2 and 3, and then 5 and 6, show the 3D reconstructions that our model came up with. And they're not perfect, but they're pretty good. They're in the right ballpark. Okay, I want to tell you about 2 results. The first one I'm going to go quickly on. It has to do with viewpoint dependency. It turns out that our approach will give you viewpoint dependency despite the fact that it uses object-centered representations. So why is that? Here's the intuition. Images of an object from different viewpoints carry different information. And therefore, when you do inference, so you're inferring the shape representation of the same object, well, your inferred shape representations are going to differ depending on viewpoints. And that's going to give you viewpoint dependency. So the theoretical implication of that is Viewpoint dependency is not diagnostic of whether object shape representations are 2D versus 3D, nor does it provide evidence about whether these representations are view-dependent or view-independent. So contrary to what has been argued in the literature. This result I will give you a little bit more detail on. We wanted to address some issues with neural networks. So we did an experiment. On each trial of our experiment, a subject will see a target object and 2 comparison objects, and they'll judge which comparison is most similar in shape to the target. 36 subjects, 100 trials per subject. We did this using Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk is a web-based crowdsourcing platform. So here's the kind of stimuli. This might be a target, and we'll manipulate it to form objects. Change the size of a block, the face of a block, add a part, or remove a part. Okay, we now have subjects similarity ratings. We're going to compare those to the predictions of different computational models. So the first model is a pixel-based model. We're going to compare a comparison image with the target on a pixel-by-pixel basis. Second model is an alignment-based model. It's like the pixel-based model, but first we take the comparison image and we translate it, rotate it, and scale it so it aligns better with the target image. Third model is a structural distance model. We actually give that model the parse tree for the target and the parse tree for the 2 comparisons, and it uses tree edit distance to see which comparison is most similar to the target. The fourth model is HMAX. This is an early neural network. For this, we do representational similarity analysis at each hidden layer. So it's a neural network. We give it the target image, we compute the hidden unit activations. We give it the first comparison image, we compute the hidden unit activations. We give it the second comparison image, we compute the hidden unit activations. We look to see which comparison images hidden unit activations are most similar to the target images hidden unit activations. We did the same thing with much more modern convolutional neural networks, AlexNet and GoogleNet. The last 2 models are Bayesian models. There's a 2D shaped skeleton model due to these authors, and then the third model is our model, which I've already told you about. Here are the results. Okay, the horizontal axis is giving you the different models. The vertical axis is prediction accuracy, how well a model's predictions match our subjects' similarity ratings. Note that there's many versions of these different models. Like here's HMAX. We did representational similarity at every hidden layer. Same thing for AlexNet, for GoogleNet. There's some different versions of our model. Our model did best. What did you expect? So why is that? Here's our hypothesis. To account for subject similarity ratings, we argue you need to use 3D shape features. That's what people are using. Many of these models primarily are using 2D image features, not 3D shape features. We hypothesize that these neural networks are primarily learning 2D image features. I should say that's not an intrinsic property of neural networks. It has to do with the data set called ImageNet that they were trained on. If you could train them on a much richer data set that doesn't currently exist, but hypothetically could exist, I think they would do better at learning 3D shape features. But with the current data set, they end up mostly learning 2D image features. In addition, you need to infer 3D structure from the 2D image. That inference means, like all inference, there's going to be uncertainty. You're going to get things like viewpoint dependency. And if you're going to match human subjects, you need that. So just to summarize project 3, I told you about our approach and 2 results. Using our approach, I showed you that our approach can give rise to viewpoint dependency, but other approaches can too. But that tells you viewpoint dependency is not theoretically diagnostic. I also told you about this experiment, and we did extensive model comparison, and our model did rather well, and our model, this 3D object-centered Bayesian inference model, provides the best fit to subject similarity ratings, suggesting that people's shape representations for unfamiliar objects are 3D, object-centered, and arise from an inference process. Am I out of time?
Pretty much.
Pretty
About
much,
2 minutes.
okay. Let me just tell you what I'm not going to tell you. There is a project 4. I won't keep you any longer. Basically, we looked at whether there are representations of time, not of visual object shape, but of time, that are shared between motor production, so motor timing, if you had to tap your finger at a certain rate, and perceptual timing. And it seems you can get generalization. If I train you in a perceptual domain, that'll influence your motor production. And it suggests that there is a representation of time which is abstract, shared by both motor production and perception. So that's the project I'm not going to tell you. So I guess really I better shut up. So thank you.
We have time for a question. If we have any. We got one.
Can you speed back through those slides and show me the graph of the results from project 3?
Oh, yeah.
Because one of
From
the
project 3 or project 4?
3.
3. Okay. Yes.
One of the things that it looked like when you aligned, it got worse.
The structural distance? Or, yeah.
How could it get worse when you aligned it?
Yeah, that's a mystery to us. Remember, that alignment, there's no training, it's not being fit to subject data. And so it just turns out
So it's
that
a 2D image alignment.
it's 2D image alignment, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and it ends up getting a little bit worse. I don't know if that's a huge, if that's really significantly different, but yeah.
Huh.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And there'll be a coffee right outside if you want to ask more questions.